warm welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. Sir Henry's work with the Barbados National Trust has been key to the preservation of a number of our heritage sites across the island. In our last programme, we learned how the National Trust acquired Wildy Great House and Andromeda Gardens. The Trust also acquired the home of national hero Sir Grantley Adams, which is also the birthplace of his son, our second Prime Minister, John Michael Jeffrey Manningham, Tom Adams.
When Lady Adams died, the Governor-General then, Sir Hugh Springer, whom I knew extremely well because he had been the chairman of the Caribbean Health Research Council, and Sir Hugh called me up in the hospital. I was already at my desk. I remember specifically, at 7:30 in the morning, I'm at the hospital at my desk. And Sir Hugh calls me up and says, "Henry, you will have heard," and I had heard, "Lady Adams died last night." And he said, "I have heard a rumor that Tyrrell Court may be demolished and a supermarket built there." Well, a supermarket was built just down the hill, as you may know, at the Rock, which was demolished to build a supermarket. And he said, Tyrrell Court should become the historic home, preserved as the home of Sir Grantley and Lady Adams. It is a house of enormous importance. It should be like Chepstow in England, the Prime Minister's residence. And I therefore wish to ask you and the National Trust to purchase it. And you'll have to raise the money to purchase it, and I will be the patron of your fundraising committee. Well, what can you do with an invitation like that? So I was then forced to call the director, Paul Foster, and say, this is the story. Sir Hugh has ordered us to save Tyrrell Court. We must raise the money to buy it. So we had to get together. Paul spoke to Rawdon and his brother, Douglas, about the house and how much they would accept for the house. And the house being on more than an acre of land and being a fairly solid house, although it was leaking in, we counted 21 places that the roof was leaking. Because here's another story you need to know, and it should be recorded. Tom Adams would not repair and restore Tyrrell Court in Lady Adams' lifetime because he said it would be used politically against him. And however many checks and invoices he would have to bring to bear, he said that the opposition would accuse him of spending government money on his family home. And so when we went into Tyrrell Court after his mother's death, Olive the retainer showed us 21 buckets and basins collecting the water that came through after every heavy rain. The condition of Tyrrell Court really was a disgrace because of Tom's political perspective that he dare not do any restoration work on it. So we had to get Rawdon and Douglas to agree that they'd accept $500, which was a compromise price. It was clearly worth more. And we had to get estimates on what the house would cost to restore. And the engineers and architects surveyed it, and they gave us roughly a sum of $500,000. So as the outgoing president, this was 1994 now. No, just before 1994. But we knew who the next president was going to be. This was 1992. Paul Altman and I went along and met with Owen Arthur, the Prime Minister. And there's a story here because Tom Adams, before he died, had agreed to identify $1 million to assist poor people who own historic houses identified by Virgil Broodhagen in his survey some years before. And Tom had indeed identified and secreted, as it were, in the government coffers $1 million to aid poor people with their houses. But the National Trust could not get the government's accountants to devise and work out, to meet and work out a system by which this money could be paid. It was too complicated a process. Although it's done in Britain and in other parts of the USA, we could not get the officials in the civil service to deal with it. So the time went by between Tom's death in 1985, 84, 85, and this period of Lady Adams' death in 1991, 92. And we went to Mr. Arthur and we said, we know that money is still there. I have been assured by the Permanent Secretary in Finance that it's still there. So Mr. Arthur said, okay, I will give the National Trust that money that you can develop what you want to do at the site, which is build the Heritage Village. And this discussion did in fact occur in 1994, because we had bought Tiralcott, we had restored it, and the decision was taken that the best way of preserving and showcasing the brilliant chattel houses of Barbados and their value to everyone socially, economically and so on, is to build a heritage village with a rum shop and everything else. So we designed this village, and Mr. Arthur told us he would give us that $1 million, which was now worth more, to pay for the village. And so the village was designed with 7 houses, a rum shop, a replica of the slave hut at Morris Hill, the removal of the chattel house that was at Tudor Bridge, that was now in Welch's. We'd bring that on site, we'd have bathrooms, we'd have everything on site, and we would have these houses rented out by artisans and artists and craft people, basket makers. We had an ice cream parlor. We were doing all of this, and Mr. Arthur promised us the $1 million. Well, I hate to tell you that Mr. Arthur didn't give us the $1 million. He found some other use for the rest of the money, and he only gave the trust $500,000. And unfortunately, I, who had done this negotiation with him, I by this time was building the Chronic Disease Research Centre and was not giving the National Trust the time that I used to every week. And I didn't know that this had happened. And the National Trust was forced to go to the banks and borrow money at extortionate interest rates to pay the other $500,000 that the Chattel House had earned. And it meant that all the money that was coming in from Tiralcott had to go to repay a loan. And for the first 3 or so years it worked. Tiralcott was so successful. But then things changed, and the dynamic director retired, and some of the best artisans left, and things simply fell apart. And so the National Trust remains in enormous debt, because, sad to say, Mr. Arthur did not keep his promise. So that was, in a sense, a success that turned into a challenge. And at the time, I have to tell you, we had a brilliant marketing manager in the person of Michael Scantlebury, who was on the Trust Council. And he did the feasibility study for Tiralcott to show the council that Tiralcott could make money for the Trust. But because of Mr. Arthur's reneging, and because of other circumstances like the energetic director retiring after 3 years when she saw things going through the Edos, things have not worked. And so Tiralcott has been a burden, which has put the National Trust into debt from which it has not yet recovered. It's not the end of the story, because there are two sites that I put enormous effort into which have failed to materialize. One is Culloden Farm, which at the time Mr. Arthur's government said he would restore. You may remember that Mr. Adams was famous for saying that he was not going to sleep in Mr. Barrow's bed, and therefore he refused to live at Culloden Farm. But the government had purchased Ilara Court, and Mr. Adams decided this would be the Prime Minister's residence. And that was a great decision. Ilara Court has been a very successful, wonderful Prime Minister's residence, and it can hold the most magnificent functions, because the hillside has the advantage that the flat gardens of 4 acres at Culloden Farm did not have. But Culloden Farm was promised to be a protocol house and to be restored by Mr. Arthur, and again, that never happened.
Relatedly, it was recently reported that through the charitable efforts of the Duke of Edinburgh International Award, Culloden Farm should be restored within the next 5 years and used as a youth achievement centre. Now, what about the other potential heritage sites that did not materialize?
We tried at the same time to have the garden, which was the home of the birthplace, the home of the O'Neill family and the birthplace of Errol Barrow. And so it was famous at his birthplace. We tried to get that restored, but that didn't happen. The other National Trust effort that has not so far succeeded is that I produced a feasibility study for the restoration and use of Glenderry Prison site. Now I say restoration and use because prison museums are the greatest attraction wherever in the world they are. Even in the USA, the biggest attraction for tourism, there are three big ones. One of them is Niagara Falls, the American and the Canadian side. The other is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And the third is Alcatraz Prison, the island prison off the coast of California. That receives millions of visitors every year. The prison in Dublin, in Ireland, the Kilmainham prison, that receives 1 million prisoners every 1 million visitors every 2.5 years. 360 visitors a year, literally. 360,000 visitors a year, literally 1,000 visitors a day to that one site. And if we restore little parts of Glenderry Prison, of which less than 10% was actually burnt in the fire, if we restore the relevant parts so that we can have proper entry, a museum in a section of the admin building, restaurants here, craft shops there, the furniture workshop. Dodds wants to have a second workshop back at Glenderry Prison, so that modest expense to restore and upgrade certain parts of the prison, but simply throw open the male and female cells, simply cleaning them up and throwing them open. People want to see the art on the walls inside of cells. People would love to see the graffiti, and people really want to see the hanging room, the scaffolding, because there's a room with a space underneath the rope, and when the appropriate signal and action is taken by the hangman, that trapdoor falls and the prisoner who is to be executed is hung by a rope, and so he drops and his neck is broken. And everybody with seeing prison museums wants to see that gory sight. But prison museums are very attractive, and ours is a low-hanging fruit, waiting to make money for the developer who is allowed to do it, and for the government, because as a big attraction, it is on the scale of Harrison's Cave and would draw millions of people over the years. I produced that feasibility study now 8 years ago. It's 25 pages long, it's comprehensive. It shows how the prison can be developed as a multifaceted entertainment center at very modest cost and not costing government a cent. What government should do, and should do with many other derelict buildings, is to long lease the property at a peppercorn rent so that a developer can take the risk and a developer can put up the venture capital to make it work. And if that were done, we finally, after 8 years, 5 years of the last government and 3 years of this government, we have finally had a bill come to Parliament to permit and authorize and legalize the development of the site as a prison museum. And although we've had one or two eccentrics who say it should be demolished, because like all prisons it has been a scene of cruelty, it is a low-hanging fruit that would be a win-win situation for the government, for the developer, and for the people in the area who would get work right next door to that heavily populated area. It's a win-win, and it's a mystery to me that it has taken so long for any action to be taken. Action has finally been taken after 8 years. When will the next action be taken of putting it out to tender so that the developer can buy into the program? That I'd love to see. One more National Trust site that I think is worth mentioning, and that is the Arlington House in Speightstown. I'm going to make the connection between that particular house and what I'm going to say about Charleston and my own personal work and that of Dr. Watson with the Barbados-Carolina connection. Because Speightstown is a basically very historic city which had its period in the 18th century of great wealth when it traded with Bristol. And it was recognized after the war that old wasn't good. and all should be replaced. So all over Barbados, Bridgetown, Swan Street, Spikestown, Queen Street, old buildings were largely demolished to build featureless, characterless, modern 1950s buildings. But a few remain, and so many people at the National Trust, and Paul Altman in particular, and Jimmy Walker, have said that Spikestown should be restored and developed as a little historic town that's 300 years old, and the best of it preserved, a magnificent church and lots of three-story galleried buildings. Well, nothing very much was done. The trust didn't have the money to do it. Some new buildings were built, some of which have been successful, some of which have not, and other buildings have basically gone to ruin. And I discovered that the beautiful house Arlington, which is very similar to the historic houses of Charleston, was going to be purchased by the National Bank to be demolished and provide a site for the National Bank. Now, like most houses in the old days, Arlington House opened onto the street. Like most houses of the 17th century, it was a very narrow house, what is called a single house. A single house was a house with one roof and one room wide. And that principle was espoused by the historian who came to Barbados called Ligon, and who wrote his book, A Short and Exact History of Barbados. And the idea was that if a house is only a single room wide, then the breeze can grow through. This is what Sir Donald Wilds used to call Barbados natural air conditioning. A square house with rooms more than one room wide, would not allow the breeze to go right through because of the intersecting walls. So Arlington was basically a classic house, a single room wide, and it was clearly a very medieval house, probably with houses directly on one side, because it was 22 feet wide inside at the front and only 20 feet wide at the back. It was not a direct rectangle. It was built in that sort of casual, off-the-cuff era when houses were cheek by jowl. And it had the gabled roof and everything that was classic. And I said to the National Trust, I don't think this house should be sold and demolished. This house is the last perfect three-story house. There's another one which was Roach's Pharmacy down the street with the similar gable windows, also of 3 stories, also with a balcony. But that was in a very difficult situation which seemed to be quite static and nothing was being done. So I said, we need to save this house, Arlington. And we deliberated with the National Bank and we fought them over it. And we got them to agree that it would be vested in the National Trust. And Paul Altman went out and raised the money to buy the house and to restore it as a museum of Spikestown. And it's a magnificent interactive museum. It's the most enjoyed, attractive and popularized museum of our 20 museums in Barbados. Who knows in Barbados that we have 20 museums? But we do. 20 museums when Concord reopens. And Arlington was saved, although the bank decided that they would give it a chance to fall down. In preparing the site for their building at the back and just behind it, they excavated the lawn to a depth of 4 feet, right up to the ground sill of Arlington House. And what we saw when we went to the house after the excavation and the trust was alerted that Arlington is going to fall down, what we saw was 3 feet of earth, 1 foot of loose stone, the kind of stones you gather at the beach, and then the house. The house had no foundations. It was sitting on a 1 foot bed of loose stone over the sand. And the first thing that had to be done in restoring it was to put earthquake bolts through it to tie the walls together. Unfortunately, it did not satisfy the purpose of the excavation of the lawn. It did not fall down. That's an interesting story, because the Arlington House is really one of our best features. What happened after that, in the early part of this century, after all of this National Trust work, was that Barbados decided that historic Bridgetown should be a World Heritage Site. Billy Miller announced this at the anniversary of Bridgetown. The function was actually held at Tirracott. The National Trust was on her mind, and at the end of the talk, when she made this proposal, she said to me, I want you to make sure that this happens. And I said to her, well, Historic Bridgetown has so many derelict buildings in it, you're going to have to call it Historic Bridgetown and the Garrison. Because the Garrison is a fantastic structure on 141 acres with almost 100 structures, walls, buildings, and all kinds of things. And that is more unique even than Bridgetown, and it's currently in a better shape. At that time, there were only 2 derelict buildings on the site and some that needed repair. Now there are about 6 or 7 derelict buildings. Anyway, she said to me, I want you to make sure it happens. She talked to Alessandra Cummins, who was chairman of our UNESCO committee in Barbados, and Alessandra called me and asked me if I would chair a nomination committee. So we pulled together, Alessandra and I pulled together a committee with some very special researchers. Our researchers were Pedro Welch, Professor of History at Cave Hill, Dr. Carl Watson, historian for the author of the famous book Barbados, a Civilized Island, and also a prominent member of the National Trust. And the third member was Peter Stevens, who is the current president of the National Trust, who was born and brought up at the Garrison in a house called Geneva, and he knew every single stone in the Garrison, every structure. He knew every stone, knew about the tunnels, everything. So these 3 people were the researchers, along with me as the chairman, an administrator, and so on. It took several years to get it done, and I have to give credit to Steve Blackett, who became Minister of Culture. As soon as the government changed, Steve pushed that along with great energy so that we were able to go to UNESCO with our proposal and a beautiful document which Alessandra Cummins edited superbly, well illustrated, explaining why Historic Bridgetown and its Garrison was unique and of global importance and should be a World Heritage Site. And that went forward, and the World Heritage Site was inscribed, and we were in Britain at the time. It was just after my retirement, and we'd gone up to Britain to see our son and family, and I got this announcement while I was in Britain. It was a fantastic birthday present and a reward for all those meetings we'd held over a couple of years to produce Historic Bridgetown and its Garrison as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Mind you, there are about 1,000 others, but the importance of this is that almost every site that has been inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site has a dramatic increase in its interest by visitors and an increase in tourism. In some cases, because the place is accessible, that increase in tourism has to be curbed. In other words, there are too many people destroying the steps and the footpath. There's too heavy a crowd every day, so the crowd has to be reduced. But basically, on average, a World Heritage Site increases tourism by 50% within 5 years. We, unfortunately, have not taken advantage of that. A committee was established for the management, and the committee produced a large, elegant document drawing on the nomination committee document and simply saying that all the stakeholders should carry on doing whatever they're doing. In other words, National Trust, do what you're doing. Future Centre Trust, do what you're doing. NCF, do what you're doing. There was going to be no money. There was going to be no advisory desk. There was going to be no consultants employed. There was going to be no training in restoration skills as specified in the UNESCO inscription. So we still rely on the people with a passion for this, the people who have learnt how to do a lime plaster, the people who have learnt how to deal with a brick building, the people who've learnt how to deal with a building that needs to be air conditioned when it's not a modern concrete building. Those kinds of things which architects like Bruce Jardine have become expert at, and Peter Sandiford. And we have not taken advantage of that. And I don't know what's going to happen, because if a UNESCO team were to come and look at Historic Bridgetown and the Garrison today, we would obviously lose our inscription. For many people in Barbados, that wouldn't matter, because we haven't done anything to benefit. So what is there to lose? Just the knowledge that we've not looked after our property, and we've lost that famous award of a UNESCO inscription. And I think that will happen if we don't protect what we've got left. And I have put, and the Preservation Task Force has put to the BTII, the obvious solution to this. Take your derelict structures which the government owns and ignores, and at a peppercorn lease, just a peppercorn rate, lease them to a private developer to develop and restore. You see, if you have a building in Bridgetown that government owns, that has gone derelict, has been abandoned for 30 years, and it's sitting on a valuable piece of land, and the land alone is worth $3 million, the building, most people would say, in Barbados, if the paint peels, knock it down. So the building may not seem to have value because it will cost $500,000 or $2 million to restore it. But if somebody has to come along and pay several $1 million because the land is worth that, to develop that site, to restore that building, then he's expended several $1 million before he starts his restaurant or whatever to make a profit out of it. So the win-win situation, the government will lose nothing by long leasing it at a peppercorn rent. We've had Stuart Lane in on this. He has promised to promote it. Well, if he has, the government is not listening. And this was some years ago.
Sir Henry has left us with much to reflect on as we consider the use of our heritage sites. Well, there is great potential in heritage tourism. We have seen the possibilities and benefits of this in other countries across the globe. In our next episode, Sir Henry will continue his discussion on the same topic, heritage tourism. Until next week at the same time, I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for your time.